The winter of 1939 arrived in Finland with a vengeance that would test the limits of human endurance. On the frozen battlefields of what would become known as the Winter War, temperatures plummeted to minus 43 degrees Celsius. Soviet soldiers, equipped with what their commanders assured them was adequate winter gear, began dropping not from Finnish bullets, but from an invisible enemy, the cold itself. Meanwhile, outnumbered Finnish defenders, many wearing little more than layers of civilian wool clothing topped with white sheets, somehow survived and even thrived in conditions that were eliminating their technically superior adversaries by the thousands. This wasn't magic. This was the practical application of a principle that had been quietly perfected over centuries in the Arctic regions, refined during the most brutal winter campaigns of World War II, and remains the foundation of every serious cold weather system used today from the peaks of Everest to the battlefields of modern warfare. Yet for all its effectiveness, this technique remains remarkably overlooked in popular understanding of the war. We're talking about something so simple, so elegant, that it seems almost too basic to be revolutionary. The strategic use of air as insulation through proper layering. But before we understand why this technique became critical to survival in World War II, we need to step back and understand what was happening on those frozen battlefields, and why so many soldiers on both sides learned the hard way that surviving extreme cold required more than just thick coats and good intentions. The crisis nobody saw coming, December 1944. The Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg became the stage for what Americans would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had ordered a massive counteroffensive, throwing everything he had left into one desperate gamble to split the Allied forces. But there was another enemy waiting in those dense forests, one that would prove just as deadly as German artillery. Winter had arrived early, and it was savage. American forces, many of them fresh replacements who had been rushed to the front, found themselves fighting two wars simultaneously. The first was against a determined German army making its last major push. The second was against temperatures that dropped well below freezing, accompanied by snow, sleet, and conditions that turned the beautiful Ardennes into a frozen wasteland. The problem wasn't just the cold itself. The issue was that many American soldiers had been caught completely unprepared. Supply lines, already stretched thin across Europe, had prioritized ammunition and fuel over winter clothing. There were persistent stories, some legend and some truth, about winter gear being shipped to troops in the Pacific while European forces received summer khakis. Whether these stories were accurate or not, the reality on the ground was undeniable. Thousands of American soldiers were fighting in the coldest winter in decades without adequate protection. Trench foot became epidemic. This condition, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions, could be as incapacitating as a combat wound. Feet would swell, turn numb, then develop into serious tissue damage that could require removal. It wasn't a new problem. The same condition had plagued soldiers in World War I's muddy trenches. But in the Ardennes, it returned with a vengeance. Medical records from the Battle of the Bulge tell a sobering story. Thousands of soldiers were removed from combat not because of enemy action, but because of cold-related injuries, frostbite casualties mounted as men huddled in foxholes, their standard-issue uniforms proving woefully inadequate against the elements. The wool greatcoats that were supposed to keep them warm became waterlogged and heavy, actually making the situation worse in many cases. Yet here's the fascinating part. Some units fared far better than others, even in identical conditions. When after-action reports were compiled, investigators discovered something interesting. The soldiers who survived the cold best weren't necessarily those with the most equipment. They were the ones who understood how to use what they had most effectively. The knowledge gap. The United States military in 1944 had tremendous industrial capacity. American factories could produce tanks, aircraft, and weapons in quantities that astounded the world. But producing effective cold-weather clothing? That proved to be a different challenge entirely. It wasn't just a matter of making things thicker or warmer. The real challenge was understanding the science of thermal insulation, and that understanding was spotty at best. The standard American military approach to winter clothing in the early war years was straightforward. Layer heavy fabrics and hope for the best. The M1941 field jacket, which many soldiers wore in the early years of the war, had been designed with simplicity and cost-effectiveness in mind. It featured a light cotton shell and minimal insulation. In temperate climates, it was adequate. In serious cold, it was nearly useless. The wool uniform underneath provided some warmth, but wool had its limitations. When it got wet, which happened frequently in combat conditions, wool became heavy and lost much of its insulating capacity. More problematically, the uniforms were designed to fit relatively close to the body. This seemed logical from a tailoring perspective, but it created a serious thermal problem that few people at the time fully understood. The military's understanding of insulation was evolving, but slowly. There were engineers and scientists who grasped the principles, but translating that knowledge into practical equipment for hundreds of thousands of soldiers was a massive undertaking. Meanwhile, soldiers were learning through brutal trial and error what worked and what didn't. What the most successful cold-weather soldiers were discovering, often without fully understanding why it worked, was a principle that Arctic peoples had known for centuries. The key to staying warm wasn't just about the material itself. It was about the air trapped between the materials. The science nobody taught air is one of nature's best insulators, but only when it's standing still. This seems counterintuitive at first. After all, wind is moving air, and wind can strip heat away from your body faster than almost anything. So, how can air be an insulator? The answer lies in understanding the difference between moving air and trapped air. When air is contained in small pockets and prevented from circulating, it creates what engineers call dead air space. This trapped air acts as a barrier against heat transfer. Your body heat warms the air closest to your skin, and if that warm air stays in place, it forms a protective layer. The problem is that air naturally wants to circulate, warm air rises, cold air falls, and before you know it, you've lost that protective barrier. The solution? Trap the air in place using materials that create tiny pockets where air can be captured but not allowed to flow freely. This is exactly what materials like wool do naturally. Wool fibers create a maze of small spaces where air gets trapped. But here's the crucial part that many people miss. The effectiveness of this trapped air depends heavily on how the material is worn and what's worn with it. A single thick layer of wool pressed tightly against the body will trap some air, but not as much as multiple thinner layers with space between them. Each layer creates its own boundary of trapped air, and the spaces between layers create additional dead air zones. This multi-layer approach isn't just marginally better than a single thick layer. It's dramatically more effective. The Finnish army understood this instinctively. Their soldiers, many of whom came from rural backgrounds where survival in harsh winters was a way of life, didn't have fancy equipment. What they had was knowledge passed down through generations about how to dress for extreme cold. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland in November 1939, these Finnish soldiers demonstrated the power of this knowledge in the most dramatic way possible. The Finnish example. The Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union lasted just over 3 months, from November 1939 to March 1940. In that short time, it became a masterclass in how to survive and fight in extreme cold. The temperature during parts of this conflict dropped to minus 43 degrees Celsius. At those temperatures, metal becomes brittle, machinery fails. Human skin freezes in minutes without proper protection. And the contrast between those who understood cold weather survival and those who didn't became a matter of life or death. The Soviet forces that invaded Finland were massive. Stalin had committed hundreds of thousands of troops to what he expected would be a quick victory. After all, the Soviet military vastly outnumbered the Finns. They had more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft. What they didn't have was the knowledge of how to keep their soldiers alive in extreme cold. Soviet soldiers arrived in standard military uniforms that were theoretically designed for cold weather. They had wool coats, they had gloves, they had boots. But the execution of their cold weather preparations revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how to survive in these conditions. Their uniforms were often ill-fitting. Their boots, while sturdy, didn't provide adequate insulation. Most critically, they didn't understand the principle of layering. Contemporary reports from Soviet units described horrific scenes. Soldiers would huddle together for warmth, but their uniforms, once wet from sweat or snow, would freeze. The standard Soviet greatcoat, while thick, became a liability once it absorbed moisture. It was heavy, it was slow to dry, and it created a barrier against body heat escaping, but didn't do enough to trap warm air close to the skin. The Finnish response was completely different. Finnish soldiers often wore their own civilian winter clothing under their military uniforms. This wasn't official policy at first, but necessity drove adaptation. A typical Finnish soldier might wear multiple layers: woolen long underwear against the skin, a wool shirt, a wool sweater, then the military tunic topped with a white snow cape that provided both camouflage and an additional layer of wind protection. Each layer served a specific purpose. The innermost wool layer absorbed perspiration while maintaining warmth. Wool has a unique property. It can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture while still providing insulation. This is because the wool fibers themselves trap air within their structure. Even when wool gets damp from sweat, the air pockets within the fibers continue to provide a thermal barrier. The middle layers provided additional insulation through more trapped air. The outer snow cape, made of lightweight fabric, wasn't particularly warm by itself, but it served a critical function. It blocked wind. Wind is the enemy of trapped air. A strong wind can penetrate through wool and strip away that precious, warm air boundary layer. The snow cape, being tightly woven, created a wind barrier while allowing some moisture vapor to escape, preventing the dangerous buildup of sweat inside the clothing layers. Finnish soldiers also knew to adjust their layers based on activity level. During hard physical exertion, like skiing through the forest, they would remove or open some layers to prevent excessive sweating. Too much sweat would eventually overwhelm even wool's absorption capacity, leading to wet clothing that would freeze once they stopped moving. When setting up ambushes or remaining stationary, they would add layers back, sometimes including blankets or captured Soviet materials. The contrast in effectiveness was stark. Finnish forces, operating in the same brutal conditions as the Soviets, maintained their fighting capability. Soviet forces suffered massive cold weather casualties. Some Soviet divisions reported frostbite rates of 10% before they even crossed the Finnish border. Once engaged in combat in the Finnish wilderness, those numbers escalated dramatically. The American learning curve. By the time American forces were fighting in Europe in 1944 and 45, the U.S. military had started to learn these lessons, though the learning process was painful and incomplete. The development of the M1943 uniform represented a significant step forward in understanding cold weather survival. The M43 uniform was revolutionary in its design philosophy. Unlike earlier uniforms that tried to provide all-in-one protection, the M43 was explicitly designed as part of a layered system. The field jacket was longer than previous designs, coming down to the upper thighs, providing better coverage. It was made from windproof cotton sateen in a darker olive drab color that provided better camouflage in European terrain. But the real innovation was in how it was meant to be used. The M43 jacket was designed to be worn over wool uniform layers and in cold weather with a wool sweater underneath. It could also accommodate separate pile liners that could be buttoned in for additional insulation. This wasn't just a jacket. It was a system, and soldiers who understood how to use the system effectively had dramatically better cold weather performance than those who didn't. The problem was that understanding and implementation didn't always match. Supply issues meant that not all soldiers received the complete system at once. Some had the jacket but not the liner. Others had wool sweaters but older-style field jackets that didn't integrate well. And critically, not all soldiers understood the principles behind the layering system. Many soldiers would wear everything they had all at once, leading to excessive sweating during physical activity, which would then turn into a cold weather hazard when they stopped moving. The Battle of the Bulge brought these issues into sharp focus. Medical reports from the battle documented thousands of cases of trench foot and frostbite. After-action investigations revealed patterns. Units that had been properly supplied with winter equipment and, more importantly, units whose leaders understood how to instruct their men in proper cold weather clothing techniques had significantly lower cold weather casualty rates. One report noted that soldiers who wore multiple pairs of socks in tight boots actually had worse frostbite rates than those who wore properly fitted boots with a single pair of wool socks. The reason? The tight fit restricted blood flow and eliminated the airspace around the foot that would have provided insulation. This was the layering principle in reverse. More wasn't always better if it eliminated the critical airspaces. The bomber crew innovation. While ground forces struggled with cold weather protection, the Army Air Forces faced an even more extreme challenge. Bomber crews flying missions over Europe operated in conditions that would have killed an unprotected person in minutes. At 25,000 feet, the temperature inside an unpressurized aircraft regularly dropped to -40 or -50 degrees Celsius. Add the wind from slipstream and open gun positions, and you had conditions that were literally lethal. Early in the war, bomber crews wore heavy leather jackets lined with shearling. These were the iconic bomber jackets that became a symbol of military aviation. They were warm, they were durable, and they were also heavy and bulky. In the confined space of a bomber where crew members needed to move quickly and operate complex equipment, the bulk became a serious problem. Enter Eddie Bauer, who had already been experimenting with down insulation in civilian outdoor gear. When the military contracted with him to develop cold weather equipment for air crews, Bauer applied principles that would transform military cold weather gear, use down insulation organized into quilted baffles to maximize trapped air while minimizing weight. The benign parka that resulted from this work featured a windproof cotton shell, a fur-lined hood, and a down-filled interior organized into quilted sections. The quilting was critical. Without it, the down would settle and create cold spots where there was no insulation. The baffles kept the down evenly distributed, maintaining consistent pockets of trapped air throughout the garment. This wasn't just incrementally better than shearling, it was revolutionary. The down-filled gear weighed significantly less, dried faster, and allowed for much better range of motion. But more importantly, it demonstrated a principle that would become central to all modern cold weather gear. The most effective insulation isn't necessarily the thickest or heaviest. It's the insulation that most effectively traps and maintains dead airspace. The hidden principle. By the end of World War II, various military forces had accumulated a wealth of practical knowledge about cold weather survival, though much of it remained undocumented or poorly understood. What worked was clear from experience: layered systems that trapped air while allowing moisture management. But why it worked wasn't always clear to the soldiers using it. The fundamental principle is actually quite simple, though its applications can be complex. Your body generates heat constantly. In cold environments, the challenge isn't to generate more heat necessarily, it's to prevent that heat from escaping too quickly. Heat escapes through three main mechanisms: conduction, where heat transfers directly through materials in contact with your skin; convection, where moving air carries heat away; and radiation, where heat radiates away from your body like light from a bulb. Trapped air addresses all three of these mechanisms simultaneously. Air is a poor conductor of heat, so pockets of trapped air create barriers against conductive heat loss. When the air is prevented from circulating, it can't carry heat away through convection. And materials that trap air also tend to interrupt radiation patterns, creating barriers against radiative heat loss. The beauty of the layering system is that each layer creates multiple opportunities for air trapping. The wool underwear layer traps air within the wool fibers themselves and creates a boundary layer of warm air against the skin. The next layer of clothing, whether it's another wool shirt or a sweater, creates a new boundary layer of air between it and the inner layer. The outer shell creates yet another boundary and, critically, blocks wind that would otherwise strip away all those carefully maintained air layers. This is why Finnish soldiers wearing multiple layers of civilian wool clothing with a light snow cape over the top could outperform Soviet soldiers in heavy greatcoats. It's why American soldiers who understood how to use the M43 system survived cold that incapacitated those who didn't. And it's why modern cold weather systems, from mountaineering gear to current military cold weather clothing, are all based on the same fundamental principle: the post-war evolution. After World War II ended, the knowledge gained during the conflict didn't disappear. If anything, it accelerated development in cold weather gear. The Korean War, fought just 5 years after World War II ended, reinforced many of these lessons in the most brutal way possible. The winter of 1950 to 1951 in Korea was savage, and United Nations forces found themselves fighting in conditions similar to those experienced on the Eastern Front in World War II. The Mickey Mouse boots that were developed for Korea applied the air-trapping principle in a new way. These boots had multiple layers with air pockets between them, providing insulation while still allowing the foot to fit comfortably inside. They looked bulky and got their nickname from their appearance, but they worked. Soldiers wearing them could stand guard in extreme cold for extended periods without frostbite, something that had been nearly impossible with earlier boot designs. But the real revolution came in the materials. By the 1950s and 60s, synthetic materials were beginning to supplement and sometimes replace natural fibers. Polyester fleece, which would become ubiquitous in cold weather gear, worked on the same principle as wool: trap air in a matrix of fibers. But polyester had advantages. It was lighter than wool, it dried faster, and it could be engineered to specific thicknesses and air-trapping capabilities. The development of modern base layer materials took the principle even further. Materials like polypropylene and later polyester blends could wick moisture away from the skin while still maintaining air-trapping insulation. This addressed one of the critical challenges of cold weather survival: managing perspiration. In extreme cold, sweat is your enemy. If it accumulates in your clothing layers, it will eventually freeze or, at minimum, conduct heat away from your body. Modern base layers solve this by moving moisture away from the skin through capillary action while maintaining their insulating properties. The modern military application. Today's military cold weather systems are sophisticated examples of how far the understanding of insulation principles has come since World War II. The Extended Cold Weather Clothing System, or ECWCS, used by the U.S. military, is a 7-layer system designed to protect soldiers in temperatures ranging from 40 degrees Fahrenheit down to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. But here's the remarkable thing. Despite all the modern materials and engineering, the fundamental principle remains the same as what those Finnish soldiers used in 1939. Multiple layers, each serving a specific purpose, all working together to trap and maintain airspace while managing moisture. Layer 1 is a lightweight base layer against the skin designed to wick moisture. Layer 2 is a midweight base layer that provides additional wicking and some insulation. Layer 3 is a fleece jacket that creates air-trapping insulation. Layer 4 is a wind jacket that protects the air-trapping layers from convective heat loss. Layers 5, 6, and 7 are increasingly heavy-duty shells and insulated garments for progressively colder conditions. The system is modular. Soldiers can add or remove layers based on conditions and activity level. This is the same principle that Finnish soldiers applied when they would remove layers during hard skiing and add them back during stationary ambushes. The difference is that modern soldiers have purpose-designed layers optimized for specific conditions, while World War II soldiers were improvising with whatever they could find. The down-filled parka concept that Eddie Bauer developed for bomber crews has evolved into the Level 7 parka using modern synthetic insulation that maintains its loft even when wet. The baffling system is more sophisticated. The materials are lighter and more durable, but the principle is identical. Organize insulation into quilted sections to maintain even distribution of air-trapping material. The Civilian Revolution. While the military continued refining cold weather gear for combat applications, the civilian outdoor industry underwent its own revolution, applying the same principles to mountaineering, skiing, and outdoor recreation. The development of modern outdoor clothing is really just the commercial application of techniques refined during World War II and the subsequent military research. Gore-Tex and similar waterproof breathable membranes represent an advancement on the old problem of the outer shell layer. These membranes block wind and water from penetrating inward, while allowing water vapor from perspiration to escape outward. This solves the moisture management problem that plagued soldiers throughout World War II, where waterproof shells would trap sweat, leading to wet clothing layers. Modern synthetic insulations like Primaloft and Thinsulate apply the air-trapping principle with engineered fibers that create specific densities of air pockets. They can be designed to provide specific insulation values while maintaining minimal bulk. A modern insulated jacket using these materials can provide the same warmth as a much bulkier wool garment, all because the synthetic fibers are optimized to trap the maximum amount of air in the minimum space. Merino wool has made a comeback in modern outdoor gear, not because it's traditional, but because modern understanding of its properties has revealed how well it actually performs in layering systems. Wool's ability to maintain insulation even when damp, combined with its natural odor resistance and comfort, makes it ideal for base layers. Modern wool garments use finer fibers than the military wool of World War II, creating softer fabric that works more effectively as a next-to-skin layer. The layering principle that cold weather experts in World War II learned through trial and error is now standard teaching in outdoor education. Every mountaineering course, every winter camping class, every military cold weather training program teaches the same basic concept: base layer for moisture management, insulating layer for air trapping, shell layer for wind and water protection. Adjust layers based on activity and conditions. The forgotten technique. Here's what makes this story remarkable: the fundamental technique that saved lives in World War II and continues to be the basis of all serious cold weather clothing systems is actually quite simple. It doesn't require advanced technology or expensive materials. Multiple thin layers that trap air between them will outperform a single thick layer of almost any material. A wool shirt, a wool sweater, and a windproof outer layer will keep you warmer than a single heavy coat, even if that coat is made from the same materials. Yet this knowledge remains surprisingly uncommon. Every winter, search and rescue teams respond to emergencies involving people who were inadequately dressed for cold weather. Often these people were wearing substantial clothing, just not in a way that effectively trapped air. A heavy winter parka over a t-shirt won't keep you as warm as multiple lighter layers that create air spaces. The World War II soldiers who survived extreme cold, whether they were Finns in the Winter War or Americans in the Battle of the Bulge, weren't necessarily the ones with the most equipment. They were the ones who understood, either instinctively or through training, how to use layers to trap air. The soldiers who suffered from cold injuries often had similar equipment. What they lacked was the knowledge of how to use it effectively. The legacy. The development of cold weather clothing during World War II represents a fascinating case of practical knowledge overtaking theoretical understanding. Scientists and engineers would eventually develop sophisticated models of heat transfer and insulation, but before those models existed, soldiers in the field were already figuring out what worked through desperate experimentation. The Finnish soldiers who fought in the Winter War weren't thinking about thermal conductivity coefficients or dead airspace calculations. They were wearing what their grandfathers had worn in the harsh Finnish winters, layers of wool topped with wind protection. But their practical knowledge was based on the same principles that engineers would later formalize. The American military's adoption of the layering system in the M43 uniform represented institutional learning, taking what had been discovered through field experience and codifying it into equipment design. The development of specialized materials like down insulation for bomber crews showed how commercial innovation could be rapidly adapted for military needs when the underlying principles were understood. Today, if you look at what professional mountaineers wear on Everest, what Antarctic researchers wear during winter operations, or what Special Forces soldiers wear during Arctic training, you'll see sophisticated examples of the same basic system. Multiple layers creating trapped air spaces with moisture management from the inside and wind or water protection from the outside. The materials have improved dramatically, but the fundamental technique remains unchanged from what saved lives on frozen battlefields 3/4 of a century ago. The science-validated modern research has validated what World War II soldiers learned through experience. Studies of thermal insulation confirm that trapped air provides R values, a measure of insulation effectiveness, far exceeding most solid materials. A layer of completely still air has an R value of about 5.7 per inch. For comparison, fiberglass insulation, which works by trapping air in a matrix of glass fibers, achieves about 3.2 per inch. Polyester fleece, which traps air in synthetic fibers, achieves about 4 per inch. The key insight is that the material itself isn't the primary insulator. It's the air trapped by the material. This is why wool works, why fleece works, why down works, and why layering multiple materials works even better than a single thick layer. Each layer creates opportunities to trap air, and the spaces between layers create additional air trapping zones. Modern thermal imaging studies of people wearing different clothing systems confirm what Finnish soldiers discovered in practice. Properly layered clothing creates distinct temperature zones, with the innermost layers maintaining temperatures close to body temperature, and each outer layer maintaining progressively cooler but still warmer than ambient temperatures. The multiple temperature zones represent multiple barriers against heat loss, each one created by trapped air. Wind tunnel studies explain why the outer shell layer is so critical. Even with excellent insulating layers underneath, exposed insulation loses effectiveness dramatically in wind. Moving air strips away the outer boundary layer of trapped air and can penetrate into the insulation itself, replacing warm trapped air with cold moving air. A properly designed outer shell blocks this wind penetration while still allowing moisture vapor to escape, maintaining the effectiveness of the insulating layers underneath. The practical application. Understanding these principles doesn't require becoming a thermal engineer. The practical applications are straightforward and can be implemented with readily available materials. Start with a base layer against the skin that can manage moisture. Wool or modern synthetic materials work well. This layer should fit comfortably, but not tightly. Tight clothing compresses the fabric and eliminates air spaces. Add an insulating middle layer. This could be a wool sweater, a fleece jacket, or even multiple lighter layers. The key is to create air-trapping material between your base layer and your outer layer. Each additional layer creates new boundaries for air trapping, but there's a point of diminishing returns. Too many layers can restrict movement and create so much bulk that it becomes counterproductive. The outer layer should block wind and ideally provide some water resistance while still allowing moisture to escape. This is the trickiest layer to get right. Completely waterproof materials that don't breathe will trap moisture from perspiration. Materials that breathe but don't resist water can soak through in rain or wet snow, compromising the insulation layers underneath. Modern waterproof breathable fabrics solve this problem, but even a simple tightly woven windbreaker over insulating layers will dramatically improve cold weather performance. Adjust layers based on your activity level and conditions. This is crucial and often overlooked. If you're working hard enough to sweat, remove or open layers to prevent moisture buildup. When you stop moving, add layers back before you start cooling down. The soldiers who survived the Battle of the Bulge learned to do this instinctively. The ones who kept all their layers on during hard work, then stopped and let their sweat-soaked clothing cool, often developed severe cold injuries. The continuing evolution. The development of cold weather clothing hasn't stopped. Modern research continues to find ways to improve on the basic layering principle. Phase-change materials that can store and release heat are being incorporated into some military and outdoor gear. Aerogel insulation, which is essentially solidified air, provides remarkable insulation values with minimal thickness. Heated garments using battery-powered heating elements add an active heat source to the passive insulation of trapped air. But all of these innovations build on the fundamental principle that World War II helped establish. Manage your heat loss through multiple layers that trap and maintain air spaces while controlling moisture. The fanciest heated jacket still works better when worn as part of a layering system. Aerogel insulation is impressive, but it's still used in conjunction with other layers to maximize effectiveness. Military research continues to refine cold weather systems. The latest generation of military cold weather gear includes sophisticated sensors that can monitor a soldier's body temperature and activity level, helping to determine optimal layer configuration. But the layers themselves still work on the same principles: moisture-wicking base layer, air-trapping insulation, wind-blocking shell. Conclusion: the story of cold weather clothing in World War II is ultimately a story about knowledge. It's about the gap between theoretical understanding and practical application, and about how desperate circumstances can accelerate learning in dramatic ways. When the war began, cold weather protection was an afterthought for most militaries. Heavy coats, wool uniforms, and hope were considered sufficient. The reality of fighting in extreme cold, whether in Finland, Russia, or the Ardennes, forced rapid adaptation. Soldiers who survived learned to layer their clothing, to manage moisture, to adjust their insulation based on activity. These lessons, bought with suffering and sometimes lives, were eventually codified into equipment design and training. The technique they discovered wasn't new. Arctic peoples had known these principles for centuries. Mountain dwellers in harsh climates had learned similar lessons through generations of experience. But World War II took this knowledge and applied it at scale, transforming it from folk wisdom into engineered systems. Today, every serious cold weather clothing system, from civilian outdoor gear to military equipment, is based on principles that soldiers in World War II learned through trial and error. Multiple layers that trap air spaces, moisture management from the inside, wind protection from the outside, adjustment based on activity and conditions. It's a simple technique, really. Almost too simple to seem revolutionary. But it works in ways that no single miracle fabric or super thick insulation can match. The air you trap in layers of clothing is one of nature's best insulators, and learning to trap and maintain that air effectively can mean the difference between comfort and hypothermia, between effective performance and cold weather injury, between survival and becoming another cold weather casualty statistic. The soldiers who fought through the Winter War, through the Battle of the Bulge, through the harsh winters on the Eastern Front, didn't have the benefit of modern materials or engineering analysis. What they had was necessity, observation, and the willingness to adapt. The knowledge they gained, often through painful experience, has saved countless lives since then and continues to form the foundation of every effective cold weather system used today. That's the overlooked fabric trick from World War II. Not some secret material or proprietary technology, but a simple understanding of how air, when properly trapped in multiple layers, creates one of the most effective insulation systems nature provides. It worked then on frozen battlefields where survival was measured in degrees and layers, and it works now in applications ranging from casual winter wear to the most extreme environments humans venture into. The technique survived because it works, because it's adaptable, and because once you understand the principle, you can apply it with almost any materials in any cold environment. The Finnish soldiers knew it. The American soldiers learned it. Modern militaries and outdoor enthusiasts refine it. And the fundamental concept remains the same. Multiple layers, trapped air, moisture management, wind protection. Simple, effective, battle-tested, overlooked. That's the real story of cold weather survival in World War II and why it still matters today.